Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Reynolds from Cornell University. Our conference session theme today is Steering Stormwater to Excellence. Roadside ditches are literally the conduit in rural and suburban landscapes that steer stormwater away from roads and into local waterways. Now, it's important to remember that the fundamental function of a roadside ditch is to protect the structural integrity of road infrastructure. Good roads are critical to public safety. However, roadside ditch runoff also significantly alters our watersheds and the environment. So how can we harness roadside ditch networks to better manage stormwater? Before we talk about roadside ditches, though, let's talk about climate change and precipitation, rain and snow. Highway crews are struggling with bigger, more damaging storms. This graphic shows climate change. And it's important because it shows how precipitation patterns have changed over time. Between 1958 and 2012, the US has experienced an overall increase in heavy precipitation events. That is, how much rain or snow falls in volume during the heaviest storms. I live in central New York, here. If you compared a very heavy summer rainstorm from 1958 and 2012, you would see that 71% more rain fell during the storm in 2012 than in 1958. That is significant. The American Southwest, which is currently in severe drought, is also experiencing more heavy rains and flash flood risk today than in 1958. Rainfall volume directly affects ditches, and this problem is affecting highway departments now. These photos show the type of flooding and road washouts that can occur after a regular heavy rain event. Both infrastructure and ecosystems can be severely damaged, and this damage is expensive. So where does all the water in a roadside ditch come from? A key point for my talk today is to encourage everyone to think about roadside ditch inputs at a watershed scale. That means water can be entering your ditches from outside of your jurisdiction of responsibility. In this watershed map, notice how the road intercept and redirect stormwater from the landscape. The roads only cover 1% of the surface area, but the ditches capture and funnel approximately 22% of surface runoff and move that water into downstream waterways. We immediately see that our public ditches are carrying a lot more than just road runoff. They're capturing runoff from surrounding private and public lands, and this runoff becomes a public risk. Stormwater in ditches can pollute. Rural, agricultural, and suburban runoff often contains nutrients from fertilizers, fecal coliforms from livestock, and sediments from surrounding properties. In other words, ditches are conduits that steer pollutants and nutrients into waterways. Now, if you work in an agricultural region with damp or wet soils, you are probably familiar with tile drains, those underground drainage networks that farmers use to direct water out of their fields so their crops can grow better. In New York, a lot of farmers route their tile drains to roadside ditches. I recently spoke to a highway supervisor who commented that over the past 10 years, nutrient pollution from new tile drains has caused an aggressive growth of weeds and vegetation in ditches that his crew maintains. Now, his crew has to mow more often than they used to, impacting the department's summer manpower allocation. Ditches can also drive localized droughts. The interception of runoff by a ditch prevents water from infiltrating the ground on the downhill side of a slope, ironically reducing groundwater recharge and contributing to localized drought. Ditches can have big impacts on the environment. They can contribute to flooding. When ditches intercept water from a sloped surface, stormwater is concentrated and rapidly funneled to an outfall point. Peak flow and stream segments can sometimes increase up to 300%. For the ecologists in the audience, a quick note on ditch-stream interactions. If you consider ditches to be ephemeral or first-order streams, they can dramatically increase the stream density in a watershed. Ditches can functionally lengthen the stream network by 50 to over 200%, depending on your landscape and road density. The cumulative impact of these stormwater contributions can result in sections of degraded aquatic habitats driven by altered flows, erosion, stream bed scouring, and pollution. So the good news is roadside ditches can be designed to promote groundwater recharge, reduce flooding, and reduce pollution by applying a suite of best management practices, often referred to as BMPs. Used together, we can significantly reduce the negative impacts of ditches. So we know that water flows within watersheds. We understand the harmful impacts of stormwater runoff entering roadside ditch networks. And we know good management strategies can reduce stormwater damage. But are these BMPs being communicated to and implemented by highway departments? This brings us to our study area, the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This large watershed covers 6 states plus Washington, D.C., and is the outfall point for over 150 major rivers and streams. Take a moment to imagine just how much water flows into the bay. The watershed region is mostly forested or rural land. We deduce that most of the roads have roadside ditches that funnel nutrients and pollutants into rivers and eventually into the bay. The Chesapeake Bay itself touches 2 states, Virginia and Maryland. These 2 states benefit economically from recreation and fishing activities. However, the bay receives high levels of pollution from the cumulative runoff from the 6 watershed states. In 2010, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, set new goals to reduce pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. Our research focused on the challenges faced by highway departments in reducing their stormwater inputs. I want to emphasize how the watershed is situated within the eastern U.S. There are 6 states within the watershed. Why is this important? It's important because water flows across political boundaries. Although Maryland and Virginia are most directly impacted by the health of the bay, both economically and environmentally, we see that together they comprise only 48.8% of the watershed area. And Pennsylvania, which receives no economic benefit from the activities in the bay, makes up the largest geographical area of the watershed, 34.8%. Again, water flows across political boundaries. Narrowly looking at stormwater runoff impacts that influence the Chesapeake Bay, what incentives do Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, or West Virginia have to change or improve roadside ditch runoff impacts? How could or should highway departments work across both local and state level political boundaries to reduce flood and pollution risks? Before we can implement watershed scale ditch management strategies, we need to understand what common practices might exist across the stakeholder highway departments. Therefore, our study had 3 focus areas. Do state published drainage manuals discuss ditch management best management practices? Do highway managers apply these practices to actual ditch maintenance efforts? And how do highway managers perceive the environmental impacts of roadside ditch runoff? We conducted a document analysis of state-level drainage policies and guidelines, interviewed state-level highway managers and educators, conducted an online survey of state and county employees, and assessed these policies and implementation efforts. As a reminder, the EPA, a federal agency, set water pollution goals for the Chesapeake Bay in 2010. Because state-level governments tend to interact with the federal government more often than town governments, we only sent surveys to state or county highway department employees. Over 70% of respondents have worked for their agency for over 10 years. This gives us a high level of confidence that the respondents are familiar with their agency's policies and practices. Our first key finding emerged while identifying survey recipients. We discovered that in road maintenance, it's handled very differently across the watershed states. In Virginia, West Virginia, and Delaware, most roads are state-owned roads maintained by state Department of Transportation employees. In Maryland, almost 70% of roads are owned and maintained by individual counties. And in Pennsylvania and New York, a majority of roads are owned and maintained by local town governments which operate independently. There is no common hierarchical structure to highway operations across the states. This finding is significant because it tells us there's no common management approach underpinning highway maintenance operations across or even within each of the states. This begs the question, how might we persuade highway departments to collaborate with their neighbors to better manage ditches within a watershed context? All states have drainage manuals published by each state's Department of Transportation. There's broad variation in content and terms used. Much of the content was highly technical, designed by engineers for engineers, and not suitable for the individual operators responsible for maintaining and managing the ditch networks. Designs were generally focused on protecting road infrastructure, which is appropriate, but not on reducing ecological impacts. Day-to-day maintenance practices were not included in these drainage manuals. But here's some great news. Most respondents agree that roadside ditch runoff can contribute to downstream pollution, erosion, and flooding. This suggests that highway crews are generally aware of the environmental impacts of runoff. This is really important and exciting. Highway workers are public servants tasked with one job: to keep roads safe for travel. But by the nature of their work, highway crews are valuable frontline workers in protecting water quality, and we want them to be partners in this mission. But we have a challenge. Most respondents reported using recommended BMPs, but there was also a high response rate for departments applying harmful ditch practices, such as often or almost always cleaning and scraping the entire ditch and exposing the soil. Not everyone who reported scraping followed with a reseeding treatment. Analyzing responses by state showed variations in practice. For example, some states practiced reseeding more than other states. We plan to look into why this variation exists. We suspect that resource limitations are a big driver of management decisions. When we asked about resource constraints, 75% reported insufficient personnel or funding. Resource limitations can make it difficult or impossible to achieve management goals. We suspect highway departments are making the best decisions with the resources and knowledge that they have. We also learned about other factors that make it difficult to implement best practices. Issues such as the poor or inadequate quality of existing infrastructure, challenges with collecting and then disposing of debris from ditches, insufficient access to land, and continuously expanding responsibilities all make it difficult to implement BMPs. Our study shows that the current conditions of ditch management are complicated. First, there is no common approach to road management across the states and the watershed. Second, best management practices for ditch maintenance are not clearly communicated at the state level. Third, ditch maintenance actions don't always match environmental awareness. And fourth, 75% of managers don't have enough personnel or budget to fully implement their department's mandates. Water flows across political boundaries. It's imperative that we start managing stormwater runoff at the watershed scale and work collaboratively across governments. Coordinated training and technical assistance programs can bring stakeholder departments together. Climate change is causing more intense rainfall, and highway departments need access to land to redirect or slow these flows. Reducing stormwater runoff is an all hands-on-deck effort that we can work towards together. We are currently conducting a study of transboundary ditch management collaboration between town highway departments in New York State. Even at this small scale, highway departments face the same challenges of working across political boundaries, needing clear guidance for best management practices, and contending with personnel and budget shortages. We anticipate the findings from this study will provide useful strategies to better steer stormwater into the future. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion, and please contact me with any questions or comments.